10 years of driving the same car, 10 years of packing lunch, skipping the trip, saying no to the upgrade. Say all that discipline adds up to an extra $500 a month, and you hold it for a full decade without breaking once. At a 7% return after inflation, that decade of sacrifice builds about $83,000. Now set that beside something else. On a portfolio of $550,000, a 15% market year moves about $82,500. 15% is not a crash year. It is an ordinary year, and in a minute you will see exactly how ordinary. So 10 years of your willpower and one unremarkable year in the market are the same size. One of them cost you a decade of small refusals. The other happened while you were asleep. That is the threshold this video is about. What it means is almost the opposite of what it sounds like. I'm Tom. This channel is about real personal finance, the kind that works for normal people instead of the kind that sells you something. No motivational fluff, no fantasy returns, no get rich quick. Just what the math actually does over time. If that is what you want, hit subscribe. My friend Jim is 42, a mechanical engineer. He has $324,000 in his 401k, built the slow way over about 18 years. Between his own contributions and his employer match, roughly $15,000 a year goes in. Jim has been white-knuckling it. He turned down a family trip last spring. He drives a car with 190,000 miles on it. Every one of those choices served a number he checks on his phone. Last month he asked me to run his math. He wanted to know what another decade of squeezing would buy him. He expected the answer to make him feel good about the car. First I have to define what an ordinary market year looks like. Almost everyone pictures it wrong, and the whole thing turns on it. You have heard that the stock market returns about 10% a year. Over a century, that is roughly true. I pulled the S&P 500 total return for every calendar year from 1926 through 2025. That is 100 years of data. The number of those years finishing between positive 8% and positive 12% was 6. 94 of the last 100 years did something other than the average. The size of the moves makes it clearer. 58 of those 100 years moved more than 15%, up or down. 44 moved more than 20%. 26 finished in the red. The typical year misses the long-run average by about 14 percentage points. So a 15% year is not drama, it is the middle of the pack. The calm average year you picture in your head is the rarest kind there is. That single fact changes everything about saving harder. Back to Jim. Run him forward 10 years at 7% after inflation, contributing his usual $15,000 a year. At 52, he has about $845,000. Now the hard version. Same 10 years, but he finds an extra $500 a month and never misses once. At 52, he has about $928,000. The decade of extra sacrifice bought him $83,000. That money is real and it is his. But look at what it sits next to. On that $845,000 balance, a 15% year moves about $127,000. A 20% year moves nearly $169,000. 10 years of Jim's discipline comes to roughly 2/3 of what one ordinary market year does by itself. Not a crash year. The average size kind, which shows up more often than not. Jim did not say anything for a while after he saw that. Your own line is not 550,000 because it scales with what you could actually squeeze out. Take the extra amount you could save each month and multiply it by about 1100. That multiplier is not magic. It is just the two numbers you already saw, divided. A decade of extra saving lands at roughly 166 times your monthly amount. An ordinary year moves 15%. Divide one by the other and you get 1100. An extra 100 a month puts your line around $110,000. At $250 a month, it sits near $275,000. 500 a month puts it at $550,000. Someone who could find a full $1,000 a month does not cross until about 1.1 million. The harder you are capable of saving, the further away your line sits. Somebody who can barely scrape together an extra $100 crosses this threshold long before somebody who can find a $1,000. That feels backwards until you see why. The line is not a measure of wealth. It marks the point where the market's ordinary breathing gets louder than your voice, and a quieter voice gets drowned out sooner. Once you cross it, the gap does not stay close. On $1 million, an ordinary year moves 150,000. That is nearly twice the whole decade of extra saving. At 1.5 million, it is 2.5 times over. By 2 million, one ordinary year swings $300,000. The thing you control shrinks against the thing you do not, and it shrinks faster the better you do. And the largest balance you will ever hold is the one you are holding on the day you stop working. That is the cruel timing of it. The market's grip on your money peaks at the exact moment your ability to feed it more is ending. In the year before retirement, an ordinary swing can move more money than you earned in your best 3 years of work. That is not a reason to panic. It is a reason to know which controls still respond. What you actually want from extra saving is time. An earlier finish. Fewer years of the alarm clock. So take somebody aiming at $1.5 million, saving $15,000 a year, earning 7% after inflation. Ask what an extra $500 a month buys in months of their life from different starting balances. At $80,000 invested, that extra $500 pulls the finish line in by 37 months. Jim at $324,000 gets 17. Once the balance reaches $550,000, the same sacrifice is worth 10 months. By $900,000, it has fallen to 5. The discipline never changed. Neither did the $500 or the high mileage car. Early on, that sacrifice buys 3 years of freedom, and later it buys less than half a year. The price stayed flat while the value quietly collapsed, and nothing on your statement announced it. $500 a month for 10 years is $60,000 of spending you did not do. That is $60,000 of dinners, trips, and repairs you handled yourself on a Saturday. At the $550,000 line, the whole decade buys about 10 months of earlier retirement. You paid roughly $6,000 of present-day life for each month of future freedom. Early in the game, that is one of the best trades available to a normal person. Past the line, it is a bad trade, and most people never find out the exchange rate moved. None of this says your savings stopped working. Jim's $83,000 is real, it stays in the account, and it compounds for the rest of his life. Extra saving does exactly what it always did. What changed is its rank. It went from the biggest force acting on your money to a smaller one. For 20 years, your contributions were the main event, and the market was the sideshow. Past this threshold, that order flips, and it flips permanently. Almost nobody notices, partly because nothing tells you. Your statement shows your balance and your contributions, it never shows the ratio between them. No line on it reads, the market now moves this account faster than you do. So the flip happens in silence, and the habits you built at 35 run on untouched into your 60s. There is one honest objection to everything I just said, and it is a good one. What if the market does nothing for 10 years? Then the noise averages out to 0, and your contributions are the only thing that grew. That is not hypothetical. I ran every 10-year stretch in those 100 years, 91 of them in total. 4 came out negative, 9 finished under 3% a year. The worst was 1999 through 2008, which lost about 1.33% a year for a decade. Someone who retired on the assumption of a normal decade got a dead one instead. So roughly 1 decade in 10 hands, you almost nothing. In that decade, your saving is not a rounding error. It is the entire story, because it is the only money entering the account. The range runs the other way too, and just as wide. Between 1949 and 1958, the market compounded at about 20% a year. It multiplied money more than 6 times over in a single decade. Set that against the stretch that lost money for 10 straight years. Same country, same index, same strategy of simply holding on. The only difference was which 10 years you happened to be alive for. Nobody gets to pick that, which is the real reason your effort stops being the deciding factor. You are not competing with a steady 7%. You are riding a range that wide, on a balance that keeps getting bigger. This is exactly why the honest answer is never to stop. The threshold tells you what usually decides your outcome, not what always does. Jim keeps his $15,000 a year running through every kind of decade, good or dead. What the math argues against is the extra squeeze, the $60,000 of skipped life, not the baseline that got him here. So what should Jim be doing instead? His job description changed, and the new one has 4 parts. The first sounds too simple to matter. Do not sell during the bad years. Those swings run in both directions. A 20% drop on Jim's future balance is $169,000 of paper loss. That is more than a decade of his hardest saving appearing on a screen inside a few months. Sell into it, and he converts noise into a permanent loss. Nothing he does with his lunch money repairs that. The second is the dial that sets how big the swings are. That is how much of your money sits in stocks. On Jim's 324,000, a 15% stock move swings about $49,000 if he is all in stocks. Hold 60% in stocks and the same move swings closer to 29,000. Bonds move too, so that is the rough shape rather than an exact figure. But that one choice changes his range of outcomes more than $500 a month ever will. Most people spend hours on the grocery budget and 4 minutes on that decision. The third is the leech that are certain. When the big forces in your money turn uncertain, the small certain ones deserve real attention. A fee is certain. A tax bill sitting in the wrong account is certain. You cannot make the market cooperate, but you can stop a guaranteed drip. The fourth is the part Jim needed. If the extra $500 a month has stopped buying meaningful time, you are allowed to ask what else it could buy. That is not permission to quit saving. It is permission to stop treating every discretionary dollar as theft from your future self. Once the math says your future self hardly notices, those four are defense. There is one move left on offense, and it is the one that quietly replaced saving. It is not saving more. It is needing less, permanently. The difference is bigger than it looks. Saving an extra $500 a month for a decade builds about $83,000. Cutting $500 a month out of your permanent cost of living does something else entirely. It lowers the finish line. $6,000 a year you no longer need. At a 4% withdrawal rate, that is $150,000 of portfolio you no longer need. That is nearly twice what the decade of extra saving produced, and it works the day you make the change, with no 10-year wait. The catch is that it has to be permanent. Skipping restaurants for a decade and then going back lowers nothing. This only counts if the smaller number is one you would keep living at. That usually means big fixed costs rather than small pleasures. A smaller house, one car instead of two, a move to a cheaper county. Those move the finish line. Canceling a streaming service does not. That is the strange shape of the math past this threshold. Working harder at saving barely moves you. Deciding you need less moves you twice as far, and it starts immediately. Jim took the trip. He ran the numbers first, and found that a decade of skipping it would move his retirement by less than a year and a half. A single ordinary market year would swamp that difference either way, so he went. The car still has 190,000 miles on it because he likes the car. Now the other half, honestly, because this title is dangerous if you stop listening here. Most people watching are nowhere near this line, and extra saving is still the most powerful thing you control. Take my neighbor Margaret. She is 45, an office manager here in Ohio with $80,000 invested. Run the identical test on her that I ran on Jim, the same extra $500 a month over the same 10 years. On Margaret's $80,000, an ordinary 15% year moves $12,000. Her decade of extra saving builds the same $83,000 a bill for Jim. Her effort is nearly 7 times the size of the market's ordinary noise. Jim's effort was 2/3 of it. Same sacrifice, same decade, same arithmetic. Only the balance underneath is different, and it flips the answer completely. For Margaret, saving more is not one lever among several. Everything else she could optimize is a rounding error beside it. Her line at $500 a month sits at $550,000. She is $470,000 away from it. The line moves toward you as your balance grows, and it does not come out to meet you early. Crossing it does not mean you have enough. You can be past the threshold and still far short of what your retirement will actually cost. The line compares your saving to your balance, not your balance to your needs. Being above it and behind at the same time is uncomfortable news. The lever you would normally reach for is the one that just lost most of its power. The honest answer in that spot is the one from a minute ago. Lower what the life costs, because that moves the finish line toward you when nothing else will. One form of saving never stops mattering at any balance. That is the employer match. The most common formula in America gives you 50 cents for every dollar you put in, up to 6% of your pay. That is an instant 50% return before the market does anything at all. No market year competes with that. If you are not contributing enough to collect your full match, that is where saving more is still the biggest number on the page. If you are within a few years of retiring, the calculation changes shape again. Money set aside near the end is not really about growth. It is about not being forced to sell stocks in a bad year to pay your grocery bill. Extra saving at 58 is buying a buffer. And that buffer is worth more than whatever return sits next to it. So the honest version of this video is not that saving stops mattering. It is that saving stops being the story. For the first half of your financial life, you are the engine. Your discipline moves the number, and every skip to dinner shows up in the balance. Then the balance gets large enough that the market's ordinary breathing is louder than anything you do. You are not the engine anymore. You are the person keeping their hands steady on the wheel. Everyone gets told how to be the engine, over and over. Almost nobody gets told when that job ended. So find your line this week. Take the extra amount you could save in a month, multiply it by 1100, and hold that against your actual balance. If you are below it, everything you have been told still applies, and the sacrifice is buying you years. If you are above it, the sacrifice is buying you weeks, and the things that decide your outcome now sit somewhere else entirely. Either answer is worth having. What is not worth having is a decade spent fighting a battle you already won. If this was worth your time, hit subscribe. I will see you in the next one.